Hello and welcome back to another video on my channel. My name is Jet Smith and I'm the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho. And this is a topic lecture video for the January-February 2024 Lincoln Douglas debate topic, which reads: the United States federal government should substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. This topic is quite different from the current, which is all about resource extraction on federal public lands and waters. And I'm ready for a change, although it will take some careful navigating to make this topic produce high quality debates across the board, which is what I hope to contribute to with this video. So what are we going to do in this video? First, we'll discuss the resolution itself, where we will analyze the wording, provide some background and things like that. Then we'll discuss framework arguments, specifically what values and criterion options you might want to look into in your philosophical research. And then we'll discuss 10 arguments that could be turned into contentions for the affirmative and 10 arguments that could be turned into contentions for the negative. So first, we'll analyze the resolution through 5 core aspects, as I always do. The first one being trichotomy, or what type of topic is it? Now, there are 3 types of topics: resolutions of policy, fact, and value. Policy topics are phrased as actor, should, or ought to, or the opposite, action. And because this topic has an actor in the United States, the phrase ought to, and an action in reducing military presence, this is a policy resolution once again, which means that the affirmative will be debating how there are harms in the status quo, and reducing military presence will help fix those harms and produce more benefits than problems, and the negative will be trying to disprove those things with their arguments. The first phrase that I think needs to be defined in this topic is military presence, and that could be small or it could be quite large. The smaller definition would say that it's military bases and direct involvement in conflicts, which I've provided a link to a definition for that. And the second way of understanding it would be military bases and troops, but also weapon sales, training, and intelligence, which means this topic could have a lot to do with U.S. military action or only specifically bases and bodies. So either way, you are going to say that we substantially reduce at least the number of bases that we operate or use in the region, alongside troops and potentially more, as the affirmative. The second phrase that I think needs defining is the West Asia North Africa region, which is also shortened to WANA. And that includes West Asia, which is the larger part of the region, and it has around 18 countries, but some say that it's as few as 13. I've listed all of the countries here for you to see, and the ones that some say are not included in West Asia, I have italicized and not bolded. And then the second part of the region, which is the smaller in terms of number of countries part of the region, is North Africa, which is at most 7 countries and as few as 4 countries, which would include Algeria, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia, and potentially, depending on the definition, Egypt, Sudan, and Western Sahara. Now, if you are going to try and read a policy-style affirmative that is only about one country, I would strongly discourage you from picking one of the countries that is not bolded, because it will be very easy for most judges to vote on topicality against that. I also think that you should definitely include more than one country to meet the next phrase of the topic, which we need to define, or at least try to, and that is the phrase substantially reduce. Now, if you've done policy debate or you've seen policy debate topics, the word substantially appears in pretty much every single one, as it has for decades. And it's a word meant to help limit the topic, to force the affirmative to do a big action. The problem is it's basically meaningless beyond big. And if you try to define it more specifically, there are lots of arguments that that bigger definition isn't contextual, doesn't make any logistical sense. So it's hard to believe that the word substantially will put that much of a limit on the topic. But if you're trying to use substantially, here are a couple different definitions. One is 25%, which is, a decent percentage to decrease, but the definition is not specific to military stuff. The second definition is specific to the military, but it requires 50% or more in order to count as a substantial reduction. I believe defining both of these words together will probably help with context. And then lastly, you could define them separately with just the most generic definitions: substantially being to a large degree, reduced to make something smaller in size, amount, degree, or importance. How much that looks like is going to depend on the round. I would be ready to explain whether or not you defend as the affirmative reducing troops by a certain amount, closing bases by a certain amount, decreasing arms sales by a certain amount. Either you need to be prepared to answer specifically, or you need to be prepared to explain why you shouldn't have to answer specifically. And I think just saying this isn't policy probably isn't enough. You need some more contextual arguments and reasons as to why the quality of debate on this topic would be worse if the affirmative was forced to be really specific in terms of exact numbers and locations of where things are substantially reduced. So now that we have the definitions for what we're debating on this topic out of the way, why are we debating this? Here are a couple of different points of background information that I think are important to understand the context of this topic. So since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the area of the WANA has experienced a lot of international conflict, imperialism from different countries, including mostly the United States, as well as vast civil wars. Additionally, alliances and who works with who in the country, both with nearby neighbors and with foreign powers abroad, have shifted. And countries that used to be considered the most powerful and the most influential in the region are not so much anymore. Smaller countries are gaining power, as well as larger outside influences like China, India, and Russia. Now, the United States has 45,000 plus troops spread across West Asia, but not as many bases and troops in Northern Africa. One spreadsheet that I found, although it is possible that these numbers are smaller and that there are more people that are not necessarily declared as troops, but basically are. But I found that the whole area of Northern Africa has significantly fewer troops than the US does. There's also only, at this point, depending on the evidence you find, 1 to 4 bases, and most of them are in the Navy operating in Northern Africa. So the vast majority of the topic, I believe, is located in West Asia rather than North Africa. It's additionally important to know that we have not really, until very, very recently, been focusing on the WANA region with our military due to overall strategic pivot to Asia, mostly to counter the rise of China, as well as to move troops to be stationed around Europe to fulfill our alliance with NATO and to counter Russia's rise in light of the attack on Ukraine. However, over the past few months, we have been increasing troops sent to this region in response to the conflict in Israel-Palestine, as well as several other conflicts that are bubbling up or bubbling over in the WANA region as well. And if you look here, this is a map that has most of the countries that would be considered in the WANA. Fourth, who cares or who is affected by the outcome of the topic? Some different stakeholder groups to consider when you're writing your impacts and writing your cases is mostly the citizens of countries that are in the WANA region are those most likely to be affected by the outcome of the topic. However, American citizens and people in the US military are also incredibly likely to experience some consequences, positive or negative, depending on the outcome of the topic. You also can think of global superpowers like Russia and China and even India as potential stakeholders that might be affected. And then lastly is economics. Unfortunately, war is seen as economically profitable, but war can also be viewed in terms of economic damage. And that means that business leaders are always going to have a hand in outcomes as well as consequences and the lived experience of being in wartime. So those are all groups that you could look into. What is this topic going to come down to? 3 of the main issues that I think are going to come up in most debates is whether or not the US's military presence destabilizes the WANA region, or does it deter conflict and make the region more stable in the WANA region. Additionally, terrorism is likely going to pop up a lot. And while I think that this is an argument that we need to be sensitive about, it's in the literature and it's in a lot of people's gut reactions to the topic, especially for, I think, a lot of lay judges, which means we're going to want to think about the way that we make those arguments in light of things that are going on in the world and in light of people that we are debating with who have different experiences than we do. I think that the terrorism argument, again, comes down to, does U.S. military presence increase terrorism through anti-American sentiment, through upheaval of government structures, or does it decrease it and deter it by making sure that terrorist groups don't have a power vacuum to rise up in? Lastly, I think you have the Asia pivot argument, which is, do we need to stop focusing on this region so that we can focus on what some would argue is the larger military and economic threat of China, rather than focusing on the Middle East, where there's not much to do anymore? Additionally, I know that the topic says West Asia, and when you do a lot of research on the topic, you will instead hear West Asia or parts of West Asia referred to as the Middle East. The reason why I believe the topic committee did not use that term is because it doesn't really describe anything geographically. Like if somebody is in a gigantic like warehouse with you and you're trying to give them directions based on like the star compass for some reason and you say Middle East, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, especially when you think of the planet as a globe. And so instead, referring to it as West Asia gives a continent and then a direction on that continent. The Middle East may also have some charged language in there that could be having like racial or political connotations that go along with it. So that's why the topic is phrased as West Asia, North Africa. And so several countries that might be considered in the Middle East by some might not necessarily be included in West Asia and vice versa. So now that we've discussed what the topic is saying, we will move on to framework arguments, or how you are going to set up the round for the judge to evaluate with what their ultimate ethical goal is as a decision maker in your value premise, and the way that they measure the resolution's achievement of that goal through your value criterion. So how can judges evaluate this topic? Three values come to mind for this topic. Two were the same ones that I said you should probably use on the last topic. And there's a new one that might possibly work. There's governmental legitimacy, which you can get from the fact that the topic is about what the US government should do. This might work better for cases that are focused on US citizens because it is about an action of the US government. But you could also talk about the legitimacy of governments that would be affected by the outcome of the topic. And it might help you create criterions that are more limited that will only really help strengthen your arguments and will probably exclude your opponents. The second value that I think would work is morality, which the topic is about what we ought to do, and the phrase ought implies a moral obligation, which means morality is going to get ran. This would be probably good for cases that are more ethically or humanitarian focused. If you're trying to make more principled arguments rather than practical arguments, this value might work a little bit better, although there's definitely philosophies that work for just the cut and dry quantifiable impacts. You also have more broad criterion options, which probably gives you a little bit more freedom in the contentions that you can read while still falling into your value. The last value that I thought might work for some cases would be sovereignty, because the topic is about governments, but also is about military involvement, which there's plenty of political philosophy out there about involvement in other countries' affairs. So this might work for affirmative cases that are focused on non-US citizens as a potential value, or as just a value that will trip up some of your opponents because they're not used to hearing it. Now, how are we going to measure these values? I really strongly encourage you to do some philosophical research on this topic. I really don't think that you should just reuse the exact same value and the exact same criterion that you've been using. And to help with that, I've provided some different ideas for how you could phrase your criterion along with philosophers to look into that go alongside that. If you struggle to access philosophical books, try going to the library. Try using certain websites, if you know what I mean. Try using college libraries that are nearby you, or online college libraries if you're a dual enrollments. You could try using Lilly if you live in Idaho. So try and look into these philosophies. But if you want to read one of the two government-based values of governmental legitimacy or sovereignty, you could look into Thomas Hobbes' philosophy of social contract and talk about protecting citizens. Michael Walzer has a theory of political legitimacy that basically says we should not interfere in other countries in almost any situation. Alan Buchanan is a philosopher that writes about how in order for a country to be legitimate, they have to respect external human rights, or the human rights of people in other countries that they interact with, as one of his three conditions of political legitimacy. And then P.E. Digester says that you know if a government is legitimate if you have just institutions. He also writes a book on friendship between international, relations. So that might be a really interesting framework argument that you could look into. Then on morality, we have some of the classics like Immanuel Kant with respecting human dignity and John Stuart Mill on maximizing expected well-being. But some new ones that you might not have heard of are Joseph Nye, who talks about three-dimensional ethics, looking into does the action have the appropriate intentions, means, and consequences to evaluate something? And Andrew Linklater also writes in International Relations Philosophy about fulfilling one's duty to avoid harm. I think if the philosophy that you're using does not contain any information about international relations or the role of government in international relations, then it's probably not going to work, because how individuals make moral decisions is probably different. There's different factors to consider than when a country is making decisions on behalf of its own citizens that will affect the citizens of other countries. So I think it's really important not to just recycle your philosophy, but to take things that specifically consider in your justifications and in your explanation of why this is the best criterion and value to use philosophies of international relations. So now that we have how the topic is set up and how you should tell the judge to judge the topic, let's get into affirmative arguments, or 10 reasons why it is a good idea to substantially reduce U.S. military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. The first affirmative argument idea that I have for you is avoiding entanglement, which is the idea that we don't want the United States to be drawn into conflicts, to basically join in wars that have nothing to do with them. So in the status quo, there are lots of tensions, there are lots of conflicts that are either already happening or seem like they're about to start. And if the United States reduces its military presence in the region, the likelihood that we get attacked and brought into those conflicts, or that we feel the need to step in and involve ourselves in those conflicts, goes down, which means that the conflict is less likely to escalate to really high levels, and you could get to a potential escalation scenario, even including something like nuclear war, on this argument, if things got bad enough and the United States was involved in these regional conflicts. The second affirmative argument area is decreasing terrorism. So you can say that while we've been trying to fight terror in the WANA region for decades, it hasn't worked. And if anything, it has caused people to join terrorist organizations due to building anti-American sentiment and building recruitment needs by terrorist organizations due to U.S. military presence. So if we reduce the military presence, the opposite effect will happen. There will be less terrorism, this argument would say. And then your impact is all of the reasons why, of course, terrorism is terrible. It results in violence, it causes conflict between nations, it violates human rights, and leads to humanitarian disasters. The third affirmative argument area is something about developing self-reliance. This kind of feels similar to a high school LD topic when I was in high school about providing development assistance to developing nations. And the argument here is that we want countries to be able to depend on themselves. So right now, the United States is functioning as sort of a de facto military, or the majority of the military capabilities for several countries that are in the WANA region, which means that those nations don't feel the need to develop the military capabilities of their own countries, and the United States has to literally and figuratively fight a lot of the battles for them. So if we left the region or decreased our military presence, it would encourage companies to develop their own military capabilities, which may make them more ready for conflict. Therefore, there will be more deterrent than we would be even, and they'll be less dependent on the United States. Maybe we save some money, maybe we save our own soldiers' lives, things like that. Fourth argument area is a touchy one, and that is helping Palestine. If you want to stay as far away from the Israel-Palestine conflict in this debate topic as possible, then I would not suggest reading this argument. However, there is a lot of evidence out there that U.S. military presence in the region emboldens Israel to behave in ways towards Palestine that they otherwise would not, and that the United States actively assists Israel in the way that it is currently attacking Palestine as a result of the Hamas attack against Israel. If we reduce our military presence, then that might mean that Israel reduces their military attack or no longer feels as comfortable in the level of offensive that they are currently putting out. And it will make the actions of Israel lose international legitimacy, as some would write. And you would say that that is a good thing, because de-escalating the conflict is crucial to avoid genocide and to save people's lives. Fifth argument that you could read as the affirmative is quite common in the literature, and that is pivoting to Asia. The idea is that there's not much else that we need to be doing with our military in the WANA region, and that most of what we need to do there is diplomatic and economic, which is why it's more important that we shift our military's focus to challenging the rise of China. And if we reduce our military presence in the WANA region, we can move those troops and resources to different, more strategic locations spread across Asia, which is good because it will help us uphold our hegemony or our status as the global leader and help to reduce China's rising influence in the region. Argument number 6 is about preventing harm to soldiers. I think that if you're looking to read a more philosophical case and have maybe some more easy to understand arguments, I think this is a good one. You can explain that soldiers in the region or soldiers anywhere are expected to risk their lives. They can suffer extreme harm, traumatic experiences while they're deployed. If we reduce our military presence in the WANA region, then those soldiers can come home and they will no longer have to be subjected to the traumatic experiences of being in the military deployed in another place. And the impact is that there will be better mental and physical health as a result of being home. So that should say we'll have better mental and physical health as a result of coming home, as well as likely saving lives. There's a lot of research out there about the longer that you spend in conflict, the more likely you are to suffer from PTSD. And things are pretty terrible for veterans, especially those that maintain injuries and disabilities as a result of their time in conflict. Argument number 7 is preventing war crimes. So you could argue that U.S. soldiers in the region frequently commit acts of violence that go against the rules of war or just go against common human dignity. And that if we reduce our military presence in the region, then the soldiers that were in the region will no longer be able to commit war crimes at the hands of, the United States. And you can pretty clearly argue that preventing war crimes is a good idea in saving lives, respecting human rights, and when war crimes are committed, frequently justice is never given, and if it is, it's delayed due to different international criminal court systems. Argument number 8 that the affirmative can read is about promoting economic development. This says that our presence in the region disrupts economies and disrupts the region, that makes it so that people aren't as willing to invest in projects there. And if we remove our military presence, then the region will stabilize, have better economic opportunities, and we can focus on economic development and economic cooperation rather than military cooperation. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why economic development is good. It reduces poverty, it improves trust and trade between nations, which in turn makes conflict less likely. Argument number 9 is about reducing military spending. Everyone probably knows that the United States spends billions and billions and billions of dollars on its military. However, unlike investments in things like healthcare and education and various government programs, that we can expect to see improvements in our society that will lead to that money being returned on investment, that does not really happen when we spend money on our military. And if we reduce spending on the military in the WANA region, then we can save money overall on our military budget. We could then spend that on other more useful programs or simply not go into much debt, as much debt yearly as you might want to argue. And then the impact will either be based off of better things that we could spend our policy priorities on, or on why decreasing the amount of debt we go into yearly would be a good thing. The 10th and final argument that the affirmative, I think, could read based off of what I've seen in the literature that I'll present today is about respecting sovereignty, if you want to phrase it more softly, or rejecting U.S. imperialism if you want to go all out. The argument here is that our military presence is specifically meant to increase our influence over other nations, aka decrease their ability of self-determination or their ability to make their own decisions. And you could say that that violates the sovereignty of these nations and or is a violent tool of U.S. imperialism. If we decrease our military presence, then we are respecting the autonomy and decision-making capabilities of countries in the WANA, and we are also rejecting U.S. imperialism. And finally, sovereignty, you say, is good for a whole bunch of different reasons, especially if you're trying to argue more philosophically. Specifically, sovereignty is crucial to democratic governance because the job of a government is to do what its citizens want, not what other countries want. And then there's lots of arguments about why imperialism is bad, especially from the United States, and how it would save lives and protect human rights to decrease US imperialism. Now, these arguments that I have offered for the affirmative, some of them are contradictory. I think arguments about preventing war crimes and like bringing the soldiers home probably don't work very well together. I think arguments about pivoting to other places with our military and rejecting imperialism probably don't work very well together. So it's really important that you choose arguments that are going to make sense under the same criterion and that are kind of going the same direction and don't contradict. Otherwise, I think it'll be very easier for the affirmative to make a lot of turns against you according to your measurement mechanism. Speaking of the negative, let's discuss the negative arguments now, which is the final part of this lecture, and that is reasons why we should not reduce the US's military presence in the West Asia, North Africa region. I have 7 contention or disadvantage level arguments that you could read, alongside 3 alternatives or counterplan arguments that you could read. The first main argument would be about ceding hegemony. Hegemony, not hegemony, not hegemony. Hegemony is the idea that the United States wants to be the global superpower or the most influential country in the world and wants it to kind of be a unipolar world. And so the United States is trying to maintain its current status as a global superpower economically, diplomatically, and yes, militarily. But if we reduce our presence in the WANA region, then we lose our influence and our power over that region. And that means that countries like Russia and China are going to fill in, which is going to damage our status as the hegemon. And you can then argue a whole bunch of different reasons why hegemony is good. You can argue that it helps world peace, that it promotes democracy, that it keeps things stable, that it's good for the economy. There's a whole bunch of impacts that stem from US hegemony, but that also means there's a whole bunch of impact turns or reasons why hegemony is bad. So just be prepared to answer those, especially in more progressive circuits if you're reading this argument. Second negative argument would be about hurting economic development. You can see that this argument and the last argument feel like opposites of what the affirmative was saying in the section about that. So a lot of the arguments are multi-directional. So it's going to come down to how well you can explain the link for why the economy gets worse and not better, or vice versa. So you say that U.S. military is actually what keeps the region stabilized, what promotes economic development projects and makes people want to invest. But if we reduce U.S. military presence, then the region will become less stable, and people will be more afraid to invest in the region as they see that it will maybe erupt into conflict, and so they won't get returns on their investment as much. And then again, same impact as before. Economic development is good. It reduces poverty. It raises quality of life. It makes conflict less likely, all sorts of stuff. Third argument that the negative could read is about delegitimizing U.S. commitments. This argument basically says that we have allies in the WANA region that we have made promises and commitments to as part of our alliances with them, including maintaining a military presence in the region. If we reduce our military presence all of a sudden in the WANA area, then we are going back on our word, upsetting our allies, and making us look less trustworthy to our current allies in that region and across the world as any potential future allies as well. That is bad because our reputation is how we keep our alliances, it's how we maintain our security, and it's how we structure trade across the world as well. Fourth argument is diminishing deterrence. Deterrence is the idea of discouraging bad behavior. So when the teacher stands in the back of the class so that they can see all of your Chromebook screens and the books that you're reading and whatnot, they're trying to deter you from being off task. This is like an obviously much more serious and larger scale version of this, where in the status quo, you would argue that the U.S. military discourages rogue and bad actors from engaging in heinous acts of violence because they're afraid of the United States' response and their military might. If we reduce our presence in the region, then that sends a signal that we are not going to step in and prevent those things from happening or fight against those things from happening, and that will embolden leaders of violent organizations and countries to engage in wider conflict and more violent acts. And you can explain that deterrence prevents war, that it prevents mass death, and that it avoids the human rights abuses commonly associated with conflict. Negative argument area number 5, eliminating counterterrorism efforts. As said before, the main mission of the United States has been to fight the war on terror. The affirmative will say there's nothing going on in the WANA anymore, which is why we don't need a military presence. The negative will argue the reason why there's nothing going on anymore, quote unquote, in terms of terrorism is because of our military presence. So if you reduce that presence, then you create a power vacuum that violent terrorist organizations will then begin to grow and form and then engage in acts of terrorism, causing war, destruction, and humanitarian crises. So again, this is the opposite of the affirmative argument from earlier. Argument number 6 is increasing authoritarianism. Part of what the United States claims to do, at least if their military presence in the WANA region, is to promote democracy and especially to protect democratic governments in countries that have a lot of strife and tensions. Whereas if we remove that military presence, then their likelihood of coups or violent takeovers of governments and a backsliding of democracy into authoritarianism is more likely. And then your impact is reasons why authoritarianism is bad, from violating human rights and oppression of citizens to more violence and worse quality of life and living standards for citizens. Seventh and final disadvantage or contention level argument that I came up with for the negative is reducing energy security, which should sound familiar a little bit to the current topic. But this one is essentially saying that, and if you've seen memes on the internet about what the US government does, you're familiar with this, that a lot of what the United States is doing in the WANA region is trying to secure its access to foreign oil reserves because we still depend on fossil fuels for our economy and for our military. If we reduce the US's military presence in the WANA region, then those deposits are less secure. We are less likely to be able to access them. They are more likely to be attacked. We are less likely to guarantee trade deals with the countries that help supply our fossil fuels. And then your impact is just reasons why access to high amounts of fossil fuels from countries in the WANA region is good, because it helps us with economic growth, and we have to have oil to power our military. The next 3 arguments I have are things that we could do to try and solve problems in the WANA region instead of decreasing our military presence. This first one is like an opposite of the resolution counterplan, which could be very strategic or very risky. This basically says instead of decreasing military presence, the actual solution is to increase military presence in the region. If the affirmative is proving that things are not good right now, you can try and say the reason why they're not good right now is because we don't have enough of a military presence, and then your counterplan comes in to actually fix it. So you say that we have been reducing our military presence for the most part over the past few years, which is bad and causes certain problems. So instead, we should increase our military presence in the WANA, and that will make the region more stable, reduce conflicts, and basically solve all of what the affirmative is talking about, which of course you would need evidence for. The 9th argument is another alternative or counterplan that you could read, and that is to reallocate rather than reduce. What this means is that certain countries or certain areas in the WANA have more military presence than others, and some areas need military presence more than others. So this counterplan would say instead of reducing our overall military presence in the region, we should reallocate it so that we move some soldiers from point A to point B, we move bases from point A to point B. So we're not reducing the amount of military presence, we're just changing where in the region the military presence is concentrated. And then you can read specific scenarios about areas or places that need that participation versus areas that don't, especially if you make this responsive to the scenarios that the affirmative talks about. Like if the affirmative says this region does not need military presence, you could basically say, great, let's take the soldiers out of that area and move them to the part of the WANA that actually does need soldiers. And then lastly is a plan inclusive counterplan, which are more legitimate in some places and less in others. You open yourself up to theory arguments or abuse arguments if you read one of these, but it could be effective if the affirmative pigeonholes themselves, if the affirmative has a very general interpretation of the resolution and isn't very specific, then this argument could catch them off guard. And this argument basically says, agree with the affirmative that we should overall like reduce military presence except for in this country or in this area. So you say if you want to reduce military presence from some of the region, that's fine, but we should not reduce it from this country or this area. So you read a counterplan that basically agrees with most of the affirmative case but avoids one part of it. And then your impact is just reasons why maintaining a military presence in that specific area is enough to solve. You have to be very careful reading this argument because I think a lot of judges would be persuaded by the idea that because the affirmative does not have to defend eliminating military presence, just a substantial reduction, the affirmative could defend reducing everywhere except the area that you pick, and that would still be affirming the resolution. So it would basically have to be a pretty substantial amount that you'd say we need to keep, but you could agree with the affirmative that we need to get rid of some and still read this counterplan against the resolution, basically saying we don't need a substantial reduction, we just need a partial reduction or a small reduction. So we have reached the end of this video. What are some things that I would keep in mind while I'm debating this topic? Number one, get to know every country as much as possible that is in this region. Specifically, what is the state of US military presence in each country? Because the articles that generalize the entire region when it's around 20 something countries are not going to be as helpful as if you can say, okay, this thing is occurring in these areas in this country, and so if we reduced military presence, it would do this thing for this country. The less general that you can be, the better, because then you have specifics on your side and your opponent's evidence will not necessarily take into account the very specific scenarios that you're writing about. It also just makes you appear more knowledgeable. Second, you need to be ready to explain why you think you should get to debate the topic the way you're trying to debate the topic. Whether you want to say, I want to specify which countries or which bases or which troops I'm decreasing, or if you want to defend the resolution as a general principle and not specify anything, you need to be ready to explain why you should be allowed to do that beyond just this isn't policy debate, and explain why debates across the country or in your circuit will look better if people get to debate the way that you are trying to debate and don't have to debate whatever way your opponent's trying to force you to be. The third argument I would, or thing I would keep in mind is it's important to be sensitive with your arguments, specific with your arguments, and studious with your arguments. What do I mean by this? This is, like I said before, 20 countries, millions of people, vastly different economic, social, political, cultural places that have all been lumped into one region. In the same way that just because Mexico, Canada, and the United States are all part of like North America, that does not mean that we are the exact same countries. Hell, states in the United States have different needs and different problems. So be very careful with generalizing every single country or people from the WANA region. Be specific with your arguments. Do not generalize to entire groups or types of people, or assume that a country is the same as that country's government. And also make sure that you have evidence for what you're speaking about. Don't fall back on your assumptions or what you've heard from other people in your life about the region and what's going on there. Try and have evidence for everything that you say. With that, if people follow these tips, I think that this could be a really good and interesting and educational topic, and it's definitely something that's current and affecting people in the real world right now. I hope that this video was helpful to you, and please make sure to like and subscribe as it really does help me out, and leave any comments if you have any questions. Have a good one, and I will see you in the next video.